Thank you. Excellencies all, for those of you who are familiar with cricket, this keynote will not be a test match innings, but will be a T20 innings, so that I will be in and out very fast because I'm conscious of the time. But I wanted, in addressing the issue of the New Middle Passage, to make the point that the New Middle Passage is effectively about us taking control. The last Middle Passage, we were the victims. The New Middle Passage, we must be the directors and the beneficiaries. And for that to happen, it means, therefore, that we must have the institutional framework in order. And that is why, whether it is with respect to the institutional arrangements of the AU, CARICOM, and, as we heard Prime Minister Gonzalez say this morning, the ABCD Commission, which, quite frankly, can house the Blue Ribbon panel that I've asked for to meet urgently, to be established, and to meet urgently on connectivity. Because, as Ralph so eloquently put it, you are effectively bringing together a quarter of the world's population. But secondly, people will only trump if they have a weapon. And the weapon in today's world that others understand is finance. And that is why the Bridgetown Initiative is so important to us. And that is why some of us leave here to go to Paris as a staging point, not as a destination. Paris is not a pledging conference. Paris is not about getting definitive decisions, because all who are needed for that are required in a multilateral process. But Paris is about boosting ambition and increasing solidarity. And the Bridgetown Initiative, at its heart, says this, and I learned a new phrase just now from the head of the Africa Finance Corporation, a prejudice premium. There is a prejudice premium that regrettably attaches to the cost of finance in the Global South. And that, therefore, is what we must fight against. In the Bridgetown Initiative, we say, let us look at reforming the multilateral system. The international financial institutions that govern so much of what we do were created when we were not even independent nations, as I said this morning. It also means that not only should we get them to understand our journey, but we need them to understand that we need long-term capital to do much of what has to be done. It cannot be that it is easier for our citizens to get a 25-year mortgage than it is for a country to be able to borrow for development of schools or hospitals. The terms for which we are given are invariably 10, 15, and 20 years. When we look at what Britain took in order to be able to recover from World War I, they issued a bond in 1914, they issued a bond in 1917. By 1932, they realized that they could not repay for the war while borrowing for the reconstruction of Britain. And therefore, that bond was eventually replaced with a perpetual bond. Those two bonds were replaced with a perpetual bond that was not repaid until 2014. Similarly, when Germany lost the war, and many of you may have heard me say this already, the North Atlantic countries came together in a pact to be able to determine that Germany should not repay more than 3 to 4% of its exports in debt service. We simply say that, particularly as we fight the development challenges as expressed by the Sustainable Development Goals, including in particular the climate crisis, that we need to be able to have access to long-term capital, and it therefore means a significant rethink of how the multilateral development institutions function. It may mean that we have to move beyond public capital finance in the World Bank, and we understand that because most multinational corporations have a balance sheet that is bigger than 2/3 of the world's countries. And therefore, they have to be brought to the table if we're going to be able to amplify the resources to be able to meet the challenges of this polycrisis moment from climate to inflation to pandemic to the other challenges of digital divide and lack of educational opportunities and poor access to healthcare as a result of the consequences of the pandemic. We need to be able to review the issue of debt sustainability. The Maastricht Treaty and Rogoff all said 60% debt to GDP ratio, and we all fell in line. Problem is that everything that we were told to do, as I said this morning, they've done otherwise. And what has happened now is that almost every single European country has a debt to GDP ratio in excess of 90%. They admit and concede that they can't easily change their treaty arrangements. But if we don't change the anchor, if we continue to use 60%, it means that the trajectory that Ghana, that Barbados, that all of us will have to face will be too steep. And what is needed now is a more gradual approach to the debt sustainability. And we've also determined that there is a broader appetite for that kind of tolerance, so that others have begun to understand you can bring back down debt overnight, but you cannot recover from social implosion in under a generation. And if too much austerity, as the United Kingdom is finding out, a la David Cameron, has left you in this position, you are literally weakening your institutions and your human capacity to fuel growth as we go forward. We also believe that separate from the reform of the multilateral development banks and the increased capital, separate from the long-term nature of the capital we need to borrow, the debt sustainability, that we need to be able to lower and level the costs of debt for the private sector, particularly in the global south. But we use first and foremost the objective of climate mitigation to do so. And what do I mean? Climate mitigation, it matters not whether it takes place in Africa or Europe or the Caribbean or the Antarctic. It doesn't matter. The important thing is to keep the world's temperatures, the planet's temperatures, below 1.5 degrees. And therefore, we need to be able to create a mechanism that avoids the prejudice premium, that avoids the fact that most private sector people will tell you, oh, we don't understand the risk in Africa, or we don't understand the risk in the Caribbean or Latin America. Why? Some of it may be a currency risk, but the IMF is well placed to be able to help us deconstruct that. Some of it may be unconscious bias, I don't know. But what I do know is that the JETP project that was announced with much fanfare in Glasgow for South Africa has not yet gotten off the ground. And a large part of it is that the cost of capital is simply too high, too expensive, as compared to what it would be in the North Atlantic countries. Now, we need to find a way of removing that and ensuring that any project that is designed to be able to achieve climate mitigation, whether in the north or the south, can attract the same cost of capital, because it is not just a global public good, it is the basis upon which we shall sustain life on this planet. And then finally, I want to share with you a mechanism that Ken knows this. A year ago, we would speak about natural disaster clauses, and I would say Barbados has the bonds, Grenada and Barbados. We have the bonds that have natural disaster clauses. We're the biggest issuer of commercial paper with them. And what does it mean? God forbid that we are hit with a hurricane this season. Indeed, as we spoke, Prime Minister Gonzalez reminded me that our first major system is likely to hit the region or potentially put the region at risk as early as Friday this week. If we get hit above a certain level with a hurricane or floods, we can suspend all of our commercial paper debt payments for 2 years. It gives us the elbow room to be able to meet the needs of rebuilding the country, particularly since the level of uninsurance and underinsurance is increasing exponentially because the premium have increased substantially. And secondly, it gives the lender the certainty that the contract for lending is still intact and that we will repay, but at the back end of the loan, and effectively it is net present value neutral. Now, what does this mean in real terms? A lot of fancy talk. That if we get hit, we are going to be able to use the equivalent of 19% of GDP, 19. There is no country, there is no company, there is no institution that will give us the equivalent of almost 20% of GDP in a climate crisis. They are now beginning to see movement. The United Kingdom is likely to include it in its export lending contracts. We are hoping that others across the world will understand the wisdom, and in fact, rather than increase risk, it reduces the risk for the lender of the funds. Now, I ask us to apply our hearts to these simple initiatives in the Bridgetown Initiative. They are intended to be able to make access to finance more affordable and possible. Without access to finance, without improving our institutional framework, we are not going to be able to achieve much of which we have talked about here today. And that is why the African Exim Bank continues to play that critical role. I'll make one last point before leaving to show you why what we are doing with the payment system is so critical. And Prime Minister Gonzalez will probably be able to speak better to this than I can, because I was a schoolgirl. We devised something called the CARICOM Multilateral Clearing Facility, which was intended to facilitate interregional trade. But unlike PAPS, there was no guarantor. And therefore, when a country got into difficulties with respect to liquidity, it meant that that money remained owing. The difference this time around is the courage and the commitment of the Africa Exim Bank to be able to say, as we have done here in Africa, we are prepared to guarantee this mechanism to ensure, as you heard President Ruto say today, why should my traders in Kenya and Djibouti have to trade in a currency that has nothing at all to do with what we are trading, perhaps not even the location of the goods which we are trading? The only way we are going to make that difference is through the institutional capacity being delivered by the Africa Exim Bank. And this time round, in the words of Jimmy Cliff, we can get it if we really want, if we try and try and try. This time we are trying again, and I believe that the interregional trade, not only of the Caribbean community, but across the Atlantic, will make a significant dent. I know that the head of the Caribbean Private Sector Organization is here, and that means that we mean business when we have come to Accra this time. So thank you, and I look forward, therefore, to us shaping the new Middle Passage on our terms as beneficiaries for the benefit of our people. Thank you.